Wonderful. Welcome to Ethos of Humanity. This is episode 18, and I am joined with Cody Lakevold. Thank you for joining me today.
I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah, I am just beyond thrilled. I took a little hiatus before just around my birthday. And so listening to a lot of your story, it just coincides so much with mine and reminds me much of the work that I'm doing. And so for the audience, just for a little background, Cody Lakevold is a published author, a mental health advocate, and public speaker. Cody is the co-founder of Longship and Look Health, discussing topics such as responsibility for your health, navigating suffering, and why prevention and brotherhood is so important. And so, yeah, I would love to get started right away and hear a lot about what your story is, if you don't mind sharing.
No, of course not. I mean, I was born here. I'm an Edmontonian at heart. In fact, I was born in St. Albert and raised in a rather remarkable family. It's a funny thing with the work that I do, and I hear so many stories of broken families and hardship and, and a lot of abuse and all of that kind of stuff. Realistically, as a child, was born into just a relatively remarkable family unit. My mom was a pediatric nurse. My father was a stockbroker. My brother, who was 2.5 years older than me, was just an amazing human. I mean, don't get me wrong, he was my older brother, so he was a pain in the ass often, but he loved me desperately and I loved him. And so we were very, very tight knit. And as we grew up, as tends to happen in life, a few curveballs. My mom ended up getting hit by a truck when I was around 11 years old, which robbed her of her vocation. So she was no longer able to work. They put her on a bunch of medication. She was dealing with manic depression, and the pain that was caused to her spinal cord warranted some OxyContin. So she was put on Oxy and then lost herself to addiction. She became deeply depressed, very manic, developed some pretty interesting addictions. She became a gambling addict. Meanwhile, my brother was excelling in baseball. My dad was gaining momentum in his own vocation, gaining momentum in success as a portfolio manager. But a lot of effort with mom in trying to figure out what was going on. And I didn't really know where I stood necessarily. I looked up to my brother and idolized him to a certain extent. He was a really good looking guy and very capable. And on top of that, charismatic and kind. And so everybody loved him. I myself was overweight with 2 sets of teeth. I was born with an additional set of adult teeth. So awkward, horrible acne. I was almost blind. I mean, I was a bit of a biological mess. And so, there's my incredible brother, whom, despite all this, continued to think that I was one of the coolest people around. So, that gave me some level of confidence, and it warranted just a really deep and close relationship to him and to my father, who was truly dedicated to the family and trying to help my mother along. And we all were, but as young kids, I think it was challenging to deal with my mother because I didn't understand what was going on at the time. And so she could be rather harsh. Time went on and Jesse went to play baseball in California. Mom continued to kind of grow deeper into her depression. And after I graduated university, I got a degree in psychology and ended up joining my father in finance. Which was amazing, which I never thought I was going to be a stockbroker. I realistically had no aims of getting into finance, but I loved my dad and I loved working with him. And so I joined him in his practice. And for 10 years, we worked together, almost 10 years. And then in and around 2012, Dad was diagnosed with Parkinson's, which was a tough diagnosis to get. And he got sick very, very fast. You hear these stories of the celebrities like Michael J. Fox and Muhammad Ali, who have been suffering Parkinson's for decades. That was not the case for my father. My father got Parkinson's, and then his health just plummeted, which was scary, which was a hard thing to watch. He's been this pillar of strength for the entirety of my existence, and he was doing unwell. During that time, my brother had returned from California. He didn't make it to the pros, which was, I think he had put a lot of pressure on himself, and others had put a lot of pressure on him with the hopes that he could actually make it into professional ball. He didn't. And so when he came home, I think his sense of purpose was lost. And so he turned to the bottle and started drinking. Developed a profound alcoholism, something to try to curb the edge of his lack of purpose. And then mom was still deep in the throes of an OxyContin addiction. It got worse and worse and worse to the point where she was no longer functional. She pretty much just lived on the couch. And so the diagnosis of dad getting Parkinson's was a tough pill to swallow, to the extent that I think my own psyche intervened by the savior complex of promising him that, I'm going to figure out how to fix his Parkinson's somehow, and don't worry about Jesse. I'm going to take care of him, and I'll figure out mom as well. And in 2014, my dad went on vacation with my mother, and they went to Kelowna, and he ended up taking his life. He ended his life in the Okanagan. So I got the news that dad was missing. I was obviously still back here working in Edmonton, flew out to Kelowna with my then wife, Jeline, and we had just had our newborn daughter. At the time, she was about to turn 1. And we spent 3 days searching for the body, didn't find it. So now it was incumbent upon me to try and figure out what we were going to do next. And yeah, that was challenging. The way that my mentality works is that challenge is a distraction, and I was focused on, okay, well, I'll steer my efforts towards taking care of mom and taking care of my brother, raising my daughter, and making sure that they're safe and that they're okay, and continuing the work, because my dad was my partner. So now all of a sudden I had, twice the workload. So I limped along in my career as a stockbroker for a little while longer. During that time, my brother's alcoholism, of course it did. It got significantly worse and was already pretty terrifying. 10 months after dad passed away, Jesse, who was living at my mom's house at the time in St. Albert, got into an argument with her. Jesse, as alcoholics can have a tendency to be sometimes, was very explosive in his anger and was never violent necessarily, but he could be challenging. And so we got into an argument with mom. Mom went into her bedroom. Jesse went downstairs and shattered a plate glass table. We don't know how, but he ended up severing his artery and he bled out on the carpet. My mom found him 6 hours later. And the pain of finding your child like that, I can't even imagine. I hope to God that I'd never have to. But mom was put in a particular place. And so I got the phone call, went by the house, police and ambulance. I went downstairs to say goodbye to my brother, and then brought my mom with me, and she came and stayed with us for a little while longer. And again, the distraction of challenge. Now my efforts need to focus on my mom. Mom was not doing good, had not been doing good for decades at this point. And so it was deeply disconcerting. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I was hell-bent on the idea of ensuring that she was going to survive. And so we had my brother's funeral, which was a day before my first birthday. Mom was deep into her addiction. She doesn't remember the funeral. But the day after, on my birthday, my mom was in a condo that we had found close to our home so that we could keep watch over her. And she ended up falling off a stool and shattering her humerus. And so I was at the office because I wasn't exactly in a celebratory mood that year. And so I got the call that mom had broken her arm and she was being shuttled off to the U of A hospital. I went to see my mother. And what I found was me and mom were not doing well during this time. Mom, because of her addiction and because of just where her mindset was, I became the caretaker. She found my efforts unsatisfactory. So we were struggling in our relationship mightily. So I never knew what I was going to find when I saw mom. And when I got to the hospital and pulled back the curtain, I found this woman who was sitting in the hospital bed and she had a smile on her face, which I found to be strange. And she offered hi, honey. And it was to the point where I almost didn't recognize her. It was such a strange sight.
Mm-hmm.
But as it was explained to me, she went on to tell me, I broke my arm, but don't worry. When I got into the ambulance, I was visited by your father and your brother. And we had a conversation about they're okay, they're doing fine, but you got to get your life together and you have to get off of OxyContin. I'd never heard my mom speak of getting off of Oxy ever. It just really wasn't ever a part of the conversation, though I wish it had been. And yeah, that was a profoundly strange conversation and which coerced me to go and have a conversation with the doctor and ask them what they put her on. Turns out they put her on ketamine because she was on so much Oxy that additional morphine would have killed her. So she did took a massive dose of ketamine, which is a hell of a painkiller, but also a profound psychedelic.
Yeah.
And she had this experience. And when she came out of it, she was determined to get off of OxyContin. And so from that day forward, we started working towards getting her off of Oxy.
Amazing. And It was a very unique time, I'm sure, because there
Yeah.
wasn't a lot of information about opioids and the side effects and the long-term effects of use.
Yeah, I mean, the opiate crisis has been such that there's been a lack of information in terms of its utility for chronic pain. Opiates are profoundly useful when it comes to something that has just occurred, and we need to dull the edge of that blade post surgery, after a break, after physiological trauma. Opiates are profoundly useful, but for chronic pain, they're not. And she had been on it for 20 years. So it really wasn't having much of an effect. So when she was on the ketamine, all of a sudden it was a different experience entirely. So mom started down the path of recovery, and she ended up, it took us a year, but we got her off of Oxycontin. The other thing was, during that time, I mean, this would be 2015. There wasn't a lot of conversation surrounding psychedelics and the potency of psychedelic application for mental health. And so I didn't know what happened. All I knew that it was incredibly powerful. And so, yeah, she started rebuilding her life. My marriage at the time had taken the brunt of that squall. And unfortunately, I ended up getting divorced. I moved into her condo, which was a strange experience in and of itself, but it was close to the house, so I could be close to my child, even when she wasn't with me. But I had my mom to look after. Sorry, I hadn't moved in there yet. But mom was living there, and we had started down the path of looking after her. And before my marriage had ended, things were getting profoundly complicated at home. I didn't know how to communicate to my then wife what was going on. There was a lot of tension in the household, and I was very much of the kind of mindset of, doing that masculine thing of, I'm fine. I'm just going to work forward. And if I did put things on the table, it became a very complicated conversation, which I didn't really want to entertain. My job at that time was just to ensure that my mom was doing okay. I ended up quitting my career. I left the practice and started an organization called Holos, which functioned in workplace mental health and wellness. The idea being that a productive organization benefits profoundly from a happy workforce. And that felt more like me. That, I loved my job, but I loved my career with my dad because I got to work with my dad. Now that dad was gone, the lust for that gig had dissipated. And so I had decided to leave it and to start a new company, which my mom, as she was recovering, we started rekindling this relationship, and she was my financier. She ended up financing my first gig, my first foray into entrepreneurialism, which was incredible. And so me and mom got closer and closer. She developed a remarkable relationship to my daughter. My daughter became her favorite thing, her reason for being. My daughter, in turn, loved her grandmother desperately. And so any chance that we could have to spend time together was always on the table. And I ended up getting a decent contract and working in the States for Holos. And part of that contract was working in North Carolina. And as I was working there, I was trying to get in touch with my mom. I'd been there for about 2 weeks. And all of a sudden, it was harder and harder to get in touch with my mother. And after a few days, we ended up sending my then nanny over to check on my mom. And my nanny, I got into her condo and found my mom passed away in her bed. And it turned out that she had developed pneumonia and slipped away, which was it, it, an indescribable feeling, realistically, to go from having this family to having no. And, and gratefully, I still had a daughter to look after, because without her, things could have gotten progressively worse from there. They did anyways, but could have gotten worse. I came back from North Carolina, buried my mom, and then without the distraction of having somebody to take care of, I was left to my own devices of trying to figure out what to do with my life. And I noticed that my brain was no longer cooperating. A number of people during that time had talked to me about, are you seeking therapy? And yes, I was. I was going to talk therapy every week with a remarkable therapist, a guy by the name of Roger Thiessen, who I can't speak more highly of. But there was only so much that I was willing to let Roger into during that time. And I think I was also trying to convince him, by way of trying to convince myself that I was okay. I was trying to convince my therapists and friends and that I was doing fine. But I started having these nightmares after mom's passing. And it was every night, unrelenting. And it was the same kind of nightmare, though the different kind of framing of it. But every night I would dream of a small child being cannibalized by a group of adults, something so sick and vile that you wake up from. I would wake up and I'd be drenched in sweat, and and I'd have to get up and towel off. But it was so sick that, I had to question my own mentality. Like, how could something so perverse and broken and awful and evil be stuck in my head? But I couldn't shake it, like, try as I might. Night terrors, I don't know if you have any experience with that kind of thing.
I've had experiences where, you get the call that someone's passed and you relive it over and over and over again.
Yeah,
And it's crazy how abstract grief is.
right. Yeah, well said.
I would say for myself personally, it's like you break every single bone in your body emotionally. It's like you don't even necessarily heal them all, but it takes so much time to get that support and build that
Yeah.
rehabilitation process. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for me, that's a great way of putting it. The fracture that came with it was something that I didn't know how to stitch back together. I couldn't make the dream stop. I started having visions of my daughter getting run over by a bus. She was just a little girl at the time, but what I didn't understand was that my amygdala had gone into overdrive and I was suffering complex PTSD. Meanwhile, I'm one of the directors at the Mental Health Foundation. I'm the chair of fund development for them. I've been working with them for 8 years.
Amazing.
Yeah, so I ended up having a conversation with my aunt, who is my mother's sister, who's a counselor out of Calgary, and I loved her desperately, but like a very shrewd, very, very bright woman. I was worried that I wouldn't be able to fool her, and I wasn't. We went for lunch. She asked how I was doing. I told her fine. She asked what I had done the day before. I couldn't remember what I had done 24 hours previous. I had no memory of it.
You've been carrying the weight of the world for how many years now?
Yeah, it had gone on for such a long period of time that I didn't realize that my brain was becoming so exhausted that it had collapsed its short-term memory. And so I couldn't build new memories. And my Aunt Wendy found that particularly interesting. So she went on to that whole conversation of, do you understand what post-traumatic stress disorder is? I have a degree in psychology and I work with the Mental Health Foundation. Of course I do. But I didn't want to believe that I was suffering from it, even though I knew that I was. There was something almost shameful in it for me. I don't know exactly how to define that or how to clarify that. I just felt that I'm not supposed to be broken. Other people can be broken, a function of ego, realistically. So I tried to fool my aunt. She made me take the PCL5, which is the diagnostic test for PTSD. Crushed that test. I mean, I think I did better on that test than most tests. It's always a bad sign when your psychologist sits across from you and whistles. And so I ended up getting diagnosed with complex PTSD and then told that I needed to take 3 months away from anything strenuous or particularly anxiety inducing. That was a problem for me because I found most things anxiety inducing, including, my relationship to my wife and to her side of the family. There's nothing realistically that I didn't find challenging. But he gave me instructions. I fought back. He said I had to take 3 months away from work. I said, I am my work. And so if I take 3 months away, I'm going to lose this contract. And he put it bluntly. He said, you can either try to save your job or save your mind. But I'm going to encourage the mental side of the equation here because otherwise you're going to lose everything. And so I ended up going around for 3 months and letting people know I can't be in contact. I need to be left alone. And I ended up having a conversation with a buddy of mine, a guy by the name of Mark Corthius, who was the executive director of the Mental Health Foundation at the time. And I told him I had PTSD. His answer was, yeah, no kidding. And so he passed me a book by Michael Pollan, a book called How to Change Your Mind, which became such a phenomenally important book to me. Have you ever read it?
I haven't read it. I watched the Netflix
Yeah.
special. He was actually he showed up kind of later in my journey. I followed a lot of more Graham Hancock and Gabor Mate when it came to their interaction with psychedelics.
Yeah.
The power of that medicine.
Right. And Gabor is incredibly influential on that side of the equation too. I've read In the Realm of Hungry Goats to try to understand my brother's addiction and potential trauma that came from that addiction or that was responsible for that addiction. Gabor Mate is an incredible individual. Michael Pollan, his book was the first step into my own healing. Thank God he wrote that book and thank God it was given to me. I poured through it. I was doing walking meditations at the time, which I found incredibly uncomfortable. I was going through EMDR therapy, hated that. It was awful. And I was so desperate to get outside of my own mind because my mind was at odds with me.
May
It's
may I ask, was the
Please.
EMDR, like, kind of triggering old memories and kinda
Absolutely.
giving
And
you a jump scare a bit?
yeah, and as it's supposed to. I mean, we're meant to delve back into the trauma so that we can habituate and get accustomed to it. And but there was so much there, so much had happened that it was profoundly uncomfortable. And
Mhm.
so doing these walking meditations was part of the prescription. And I would do them every day, but I hated it. I felt, from a masculine standpoint of I'm not working, I'm not contributing to my family, I'm not contributing to protecting anybody. I'm the one who's vulnerable right now. And there is deep seated shame in that. And all I'm doing is, walking through the ravine, once a day. So I started thumbing my way through that book and found some research on MDMA therapy and its studies by Johns Hopkins and Harvard about its efficacy rate surrounding PTSD. And gratefully had a very, very close friend who was MAP certified and knew how to run a session on psychedelics. And so I called him up and asked him if he had any MDMA. At that time, the idea of drugs was terrifying,
Yeah.
especially given what I'd seen them do to my mother and my brother.
The whole stigma around it too, culturally,
Of
you
course.
don't know what direction to go to, what's actually gonna help and what's actually gonna cause harm.
Right. I was so under the guise of understanding that acid and psilocybin and MDMA were profoundly dangerous. So reading a book like that by an author like Michael Pollan, who's so respected in his field, granted me at least the freedom to start considering whether or not this is something that I should go after. So after reading some of the studies, yeah, I ended up doing it. I took MDMA with my pal Hank. We went for a walk, and it was one of the single most beautiful days of my life, realistically. We were outside. It was June. It was a stunning day outside. It was gorgeous. And we went for a 60-minute walk and then found ourselves a park bench and sat down. And as the MDMA started to pick up, I remember Hank, who's just one of the most beautiful guys in the world, said, before we get started, now that the MDMA is kicking in and it's shutting your amygdala down so you don't feel this fight or flight all the time, let's just start by taking a look at the sky and recognizing the sky. And so I'd look at the sky, and on MDMA, colors get more electric, and the sky was blue. And so it was the vivid, vivid blue. And he said, "Isn't the sky beautiful?" And yeah, the sky's beautiful. Then look at the grass, smell the grass, bring it in. All your senses are so heightened. And so I breathed it in and looked at the grass. I was like, yeah, it's gorgeous. He goes, yeah, the world's kind of beautiful, isn't it? And for the first time in forever, it didn't seem dangerous to me
Yeah.
anymore. And I was able now to run through the series of events that led up to my family dying. As I had endured their deaths, I had taken it upon myself to apply responsibility to it, that it was my job to save them all, and that they had all passed it was my fault. And that experience granted me a little bit of space to take a step back from my own feelings of guilt and trauma and examine them clearly in a way that was like, these things happened, but they were out of my control. I had built up this idea that I love these people so much that the thought of them dying was so profoundly awful that I had to construct this narrative that I'm going to save them. And, survival mentality, which was useful for a time, but when things go poorly, as they did in my circumstance, then I ended up owning their passing. And so it was important for me to take a step away and just kind of logically work through it. And so we did it in a space of 4 to 5 hours.
Mhm.
After that experience, I never had another nightmare. I never had another vision. I had grief to work through because the distraction of PTSD was so terrifying and I was so locked into it that I didn't take time to just feel the weight of the loss. And so now that the PTSD, at least the sharper edges of it, had been removed, I could think and I could feel. And that brought about its own challenges. It was time to start making some decisions. And one of the decisions was, that the relationship to my then wife just wasn't working. And so I had to start reconstructing a life that was going to make sense. And so I did. I ended up moving into my mom's apartment, which was close by, so that Jill and I had access to our child. And it ended up being a very peaceful process and very well understood. And Jill was great. And she's an incredible co-parent. But I had to start figuring out what the hell I was going to do because I'd taken that time off of Holos. I was considering whether to go back or to recreate something new. I didn't really have an appetite to go into corporate wellness again because I was tired of asking the chief financial officers whether or not I could do something for the well-being of I hated that they were the gatekeeper to these people's happiness. And if I couldn't prove immediate return on investment, then that was always problematic. So I ended up getting back into investing, but building my own portfolio and investing in organizations that were seeking to do positive change in the world, that were local organizations. A couple, one in Montreal called that does some remarkable stuff on the mentorship side. And then a couple in the States, but mostly here in Edmonton. And that was fine. But I just, I like to get my hands dirty. And I think you're the same, Katania, as far as I can tell. You wouldn't be if you weren't doing this kind of work, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, how is it? I want to take a quick step back because how is it that you found your way into this? Like, how did you end up doing this? Ethos of Humanity, by the way, is one of the best podcast names I've ever heard of. So
I really appreciate that.
It's such a great name.
I mean, do you want me to go start at the beginning?
Please. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Do you have time if we
I
go?
do. I got time. Yeah.
Perfect. So my origins, and sometimes I articulate in a certain way, and I think I'm finding more and more just being completely vulnerable in my story is the best way to heal and the best way to own your life.
Yeah.
So I was born and raised Jehovah's Witness. So I had, a life path set out for me. I had the rule book all there.
Yeah.
And something in my soul was telling me that I couldn't be my full expression, but you don't know when you're born into it. My father had gone through a little mountain bike accident and went to the hospital, came back. Something had shifted in his psyche, which later we found out was an opioid addiction. Yes. Which ultimately deteriorated my mom and dad's relationship. Experiencing divorce at 13, which is quite life-shattering when you come from a very close-knit community.
Yeah.
And so in essence, my mom left as a way to survive. She was living in this constant cycle of being gaslit, kind of like, you're not being a good enough wife. You need to be there. But there's a lack of accountability because of the shame, because of if my dad came forward with this truth, how he would be looked at going forward. So ultimately, it wasn't rectified. There was a lot of unanswered questions. And my mom had left and had to go through her journey of, she's mid-30s. She doesn't know who she is really because everything based around her upbringing was also Jehovah's Witness. My parents on both sides were born into it. And so, I'm going through my teenage years and I'm starting to feel unhappy, deeply, deeply grieving, depressed, anxiety, just feeling like sitting in a chair for hours of a week. I didn't feel connected to God. I didn't feel connected to Source. I didn't feel like I was embracing my spiritual expression. And so in essence, I did develop an eating disorder, and it hit this breaking point where, I was dating someone and I'm like, I have to literally get married to actually start life with this person. And I just noticed that there was a lot of people within the organization that were saying one thing and doing another.
Yeah.
And I hit this breaking point, and I was very lucky because Facebook had already started. I already developed a network of people from school. And so pretty much I made that transition out, and I took this complete leap of faith. And something in my head told me that, at the end of my life, when I die, the only person that can judge me is God. And so, discovering my spirituality and who I am as a person, I feel like that would only strengthen that. It doesn't matter, what the journey looks like. It's just ultimately I was desperate. So I made that choice, and there were repercussions. There were many people that they do segregate you from the community when you leave.
Yeah.
There's no ifs, ands, or buts. Some people will choose to associate despite that, but that's very few and far between. And that's people's personal choice. And in my situation, my father had nothing to do with me, cut me out. I had no relationship with my sister. And my mom and I kind of were just picking up the pieces with some of more cousins and extended family that had left. But because of the fact we had left, we'd never celebrated birthdays or Christmas or any of those traditional holidays that would bring people together. We were very segregated.
Hmm.
So we were kind of all treading water in the ocean, kind of like building our own life rafts, figuring this out. And so, ultimately, full transparency, owning my story, I gravitated to the dance floor. I gravitated to house music. I gravitated to being in those spaces where, I'm people watching, I'm seeing people dancing and like moving their body and like almost releasing something. And
Truly, yeah.
yeah, it's crazy to me because I realized how intuitive it was. And so ultimately, going to festivals, I came to the realization when having experiences with psychedelic medicine,
Hmm.
I realized this is a tool. And if we were to look at a tool like a hammer, you can smash your hand with it or you can build a house.
Right. Oh, well said. Beautifully said. And that could not be more true of psychedelics. I mean, they played a pretty pivotal role for you.
They did. And
Mm.
so, still with that confusion with the opioid epidemic and then the growing fentanyl epidemic, there's still a lot of stigma, a lot of confusion. Being that people were using it in recreational use as well, there was a lot of confusion because people, I think, didn't know its function. There's just this gap. And I have a whole theory. I really think it's interesting how psychedelic medicine has been incorporated in a lot of indigenous backgrounds, a lot of cultural backgrounds. So the seeking of altered states of consciousness have always existed, and the demand has always been there. But when it became, pretty much incriminating substance,
Yes.
all of the practices have been lost, and there's like a 50-year gap now where a lot of those ceremonial and traditional practices are now severed,
Yeah.
and we're kind of putting the pieces together now, acknowledging the fact that you can't kind of suppress the symptoms. We need to address the root of the problem, and there's something there. There's
Yes, there's
something there.
I think that's why psychedelics are so potent. I mean, for me, my first experience with MDMA was so powerful, so shattering. I remember after my first MDMA experience, I was drinking heavily every single night because I found there was utility in booze. Because if I drank enough, I could kill my REM sleep. I could kill the ability to dream. And so it would help to temper the nightmares,
Hmm.
which led me to drink every single night for months and months and months. When I did the MDMA therapy, I went back home that night and I tucked my kid into bed and was at peace for the first time in forever. My daughter had never really known me at peace. I was still a very dedicated father during this time, but I don't think she'd ever really felt her father just be at ease. And so I got this moment of just laying in my daughter's bed and reading a bedtime to her, a bedtime story. And then I went downstairs and poured myself a glass of bourbon like muscle memory. I was so accustomed to doing it. And then I went downstairs and started working. And I will never forget staring at this this glass of bourbon and admiring it and thinking, the traditions that have gone into it and what it takes to make good bourbon and, going back to whiskey and scotch and the history of it and what an incredible, remarkable thing that it is, but having no thirst for it whatsoever. And so that was the first night in forever that I had ended up pouring the glass back in the bottle. God forbid I pour it down the sink, but I poured it back into the bottle because I had no need for it. I didn't have this hole in my heart that I was trying to numb or fill with alcohol. And that was my first foray into it. And then since then, I ended up doing MDMA and acid about a year after that to help with a psychotherapist whom walked me through an entire session, which was like unbelievably powerful. I was left with this just heavy amount of grief and trying to work through that. And I ended up taking this MDMA acid cocktail. And what came of it was this just profound, incredible hallucination of me being in the middle of the ocean on a boat, on a longship, which is interesting because I'm Norwegian. And so, sitting in this longship and being surrounded by this group of men who had been walking this path with me this entire time and who had been realistically carrying me, keeping my head above water, so to say, or so to speak, when I wasn't able to do it for myself. And so that just that recognition of I may not have my blood relatives here with me anymore, but I have this group of brothers that have been rowing with me through the storm. And I mean, it was such a profoundly strange metaphor to experience because it was, it's like I was there. I mean, I remember it to this day perfectly. It's so vivid. But just all of us rowing in this boat in the middle of this storm, and it's waves are crashing against the boat and there's sea spray and salt in our mouths, and we're all just laughing. It was such a weird thing. And coming out of that, it wasn't, I thought it would be, I was scared to do all this because I thought I'm going to take a hallucinogen like lysergic acid and, see my dead family and have to deal with that. And that's probably going to be re-traumatizing, if anything. The opposite was true. I didn't have that experience at all. I just left with this profound gratitude of these brothers of mine that had stayed with me during the entire course. And, that ended up being how we started Longship, our organization for men. This recognition of unbelievable brothers. And this was, during the time of the fever pitch of hashtag Me Too, and not recognizing that men have a real problem because we have just explosive suicide rates now
Mhm.
and a genuine mental health crisis as it pertains to men. And so we started this to try to combat that. But all of that came by way of psychedelics. And it's why now part of my vocation is working as a psychedelic advocate. And so I work with a remarkable clinic in downtown Edmonton called Reunion that's owned and operated by two ladies, Heidi Edgar and Kirby Kelly, who are just unbelievable women, mental health practitioners. They've built a practice that brings in dedicated therapy, actual psychotherapists that work alongside the medicine. And what they do is just, it's remarkable, right? But it's been so important in my life that they're incredible molecules.
They really are. Yeah, I find it so interesting. And it goes both ways with women as well. To have like a safe space, to have
Yeah.
people that it's a safe space to be vulnerable, it's hard. And I know there's a level of competitiveness that happens with men, but I think also women too.
Hmm.
Knowing that someone unconditionally has your back and your support.
Yeah.
For me personally, it's been difficult in friendship settings and relationship settings because of the fact I've had family that's been unsupportive of my religious beliefs.
Sure.
It can be difficult to let other people in. And so I'd imagine in men's, circumstances carrying the weight of the world and just to have someone to just express and just know that we're in it together side by side.
That's something that just humanity needs to come to terms with. We've built this society very much around a us versus them mentality, whether it's gender or race or whatever. And the sooner we realize, and I think psychedelics is useful in this because on the psychedelic front, when in the medicine, the feeling of connection is so remarkable that this notion of us versus them dissipates entirely. And then it's just us. It's just, and like us includes trees and leaves and grass and all of it. And the sooner we can get to that point soberly and start implementing policy that recognizes that, the better. But I'm curious. So where are you at now? What does your journey look like today? Obviously, you've started this podcast.
Well, I will backtrack a little bit because I
Yeah,
feel like adding to your Longship story is so resonant for me. So following kind of going through my experience, I witnessed people using these medicines as recreational purposes and unfortunately doing more damage than good.
right.
And I saw this in friendship circles and I felt like I needed to choose what road because unfortunately you do have to choose who is in your circle.
Without
And you
question.
have to, yeah, you have to pick a path. That there's definitely, I could see for myself, I'm like, I need to really decide what I want in my life, and who I want in my life. Ultimately, I had come back from a trip and I found out that my brother and my dad were addicted to fentanyl.
My God.
And unfortunately, my dad is woven addiction, which ties in so much when I think about as a teenager feeling depressed and kind of my dad wasn't fully emotionally present. He honestly did the best that he could, but it was a similar thing where he's carrying the weight of the world and he's carrying this secret that was burdening him for so long and he didn't maybe felt like he could express it to
Hmm.
someone without feeling all of this guilt. But yeah, ultimately, within a 10-month period, I lost my brother, my dad, and my grandpa in a 10-month span,
You're all of them.
all of them. So
I'm so sorry. Oh my, how long ago was that, Catania?
10 years.
10 years ago. Holy. So you've been on a journey for quite some time.
Mhm. So, in lieu of that, when I was working in a cubicle in my early 20s, I was looking at TED Talks and I was amazed by these public speakers because, as a woman, as a Jehovah's Witness, you're not allowed to speak on a stage. I was like fascinated, intrigued by Gabor Mate, Brene Brown, Esther Perel, and many others. And my friend had just gotten back from South America and she was like, I did this ayahuasca retreat and I had this powerful experience. And I did my research and I was like, you know what? It's so interesting how this medicine, the origins of it for thousands of years, it was always administered to men as a rite of passage to find their purpose and set them on this course of what they want in their life. And it was also been recently discovered that it helps with people that are attempting suicide,
Without question. Yeah.
terrible complex PTSD, grief, and a list of it. And so it was in that instant, and I had vivid dreams about going there and having this experience. I immediately booked it and I went.
So where did
And
you go?
I went to Peru, a small town just off the Amazonian River called Iquitos. I went to a retreat called Capitari, which means little turtle. And my shaman was Don Lucho. And we went for a week and we probably had about 5 sessions.
Oh,
You
in a
don't,
week.
yeah, you don't
Holy.
need a meal for dinner because there's like a huge shedding, purging component to it. And it makes you really start to think about the psychosomatic part of us, how our body responds based on like the mental ailments that we might be experiencing and how it might coincide.
Without question. Yeah, we are
Yeah.
closely linked. Like the mind and body is no truer thing that I can think of. I mean, it is incredibly, incredibly important that we start recognizing the connection.
There's a really good book by Louise Hay. It's called How to Heal Your Life. And she, I believe, has passed now, but all of her book lists psychosomatic causes and ways to heal different ailments just based on even your thought process.
Wow, no kidding. So what was the ayahuasca experience like for you?
Yeah.
Because you're bringing a lot into the jungle there.
Yeah.
Were you nervous?
I remember my first vision. I saw this beautiful falcon. It's one of my favorite animals. Both my parents worked at the U of A. And we always like saw footage of peregrine falcons like nesting like right at the windows and stuff and camera footage. And I always loved this animal and it came to me and I felt very connected to it. Still to this day, I could get into it leading up to now. But after that, I immediately saw a vision of my dad and he was smiling. And I hadn't seen a smile from my dad like that in years. And all of a sudden, I just started crying and weeping. And I was dealing with like head pressure and like sinus issues. And I started to kind of think, wow, maybe there's something to this, why I've been feeling this way. It's like a energetic block of
Yep.
some sort.
Yep.
I remember, trying to understand chakras through the yogi sense. I remember I understood the root, sacral, solar plexus, heart, throat, but I could never understand the third eye and the crown. But I remember he started chanting the songs, a pressure in the middle of my head and on the top of my head started to grow. And following that, because of the circumstance of my brother and my dad and my sister and my brother-in-law were like, you need to buy the family home because we don't want to deal with it. And to sum it up, my brother and my dad died in the family home that we all grew up in. And I was in this position of, I don't know if I can handle that. But when I was there, I go into this with like as much intention as I can. And the medicine showed me this 3D model of my house as you have the ability to fix your family tree brick by brick, and
Yeah.
your house is a bridge, and maybe your sister specifically and other family can cross it as a way to heal.
Holy no. So how long ago was that?
10 years ago.
Oh my God. A
I
lot
know.
happened for you 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Wow.
And
Okay.
so, like, to wrap it up, I remember like getting transported to like Machu Picchu and like the pyramids of Giza. And I see these people building brick by brick, not as slaves, but with strong intention that there was like a deeper meaning to it. But it was a brick by brick. It's not a
Yeah.
boom, it's done overnight. And so when I came back home, I went from, oh my goodness, I don't think I can buy this house. And oh my goodness, I might not get a mortgage.
Yeah.
And so I did buy it. And it's been 10 years. And I literally, as a labor of love, I've worked on this house.
Is this the home that you're in?
Yeah. Yeah.
My God, it's such a wow, we do share a lot of similarities. No
Right.
kidding. I mean, I found I had some level of hesitation moving into my mom's condo, obviously, because she had died in there. And what I found was the exact home that I needed and the exact home that my daughter needed. And it ended up being a profoundly healing space. I mean, I've since left there because I'm recently remarried to the love of my life. And we're building a family together. And I have three amazing stepsons to go with my remarkable daughter. Funny life, like
Mhm.
it is a lot of twists and turns, but that home was the exact place. It was my sanctuary for healing for a good 4.5 years. It was exactly where I needed to be. And there was something about, I don't know why, but my mom's spirit. I had given up on God. After everybody had died, I'd given up completely on the notion of it. Was raised Christian. I was a church going Christian. And then, dad and Jess were a tough pill to swallow. I think during that time, my notion of God had been that of Santa Claus. Like, if I'm a really good boy and I just pray really hard, then nothing bad is ever going to happen. And then they started passing away. Mom was the kicker, became a relatively proud atheist during that period of time, though I wasn't realistically, because I was still talking to God and being like, just so you know, I don't believe in you, which in and of itself doesn't make any sense. But it was my experience in Colombia with ayahuasca that just nailed home God's presence. And it was just unshakable. And it's like most of these experiences, when people ask, like, how was it? And tell me all about it, it's ineffable. It's incredibly challenging to find words that properly describe the experience. But I ended up talking to my family while I was out there, just like you had that experience. I didn't see them, I felt them. I didn't hear them either. I felt them. It was such a strange thing, but I could feel them. I ended up having a long dialogue. I did 3 sessions. 5 sessions in a week that's a lot. Because this is incredibly hard work. Like, you're doing the work.
But similar to you, where, you have this fear that you're going to have this jarring experience that's going to re traumatize you.
Yeah.
There's almost like, a lot of the shamanic origins talk about the medicine having, it's like an entity and it has an intelligence behind it. It's almost as if it knew what I needed to see. It was very gentle and I couldn't handle it. I needed some grace. I needed some compassion. And my whole experience was very kind, if you want to call it
As
that.
This was mine for the most part. I mean, my last ceremony was more challenging. My first 2 nights, same thing in the jungle. We drank with a native tribe who were the most caring, compassionate humans I think I'd ever encountered. Deep-seated Christian faith, these people, which was interesting, but old Christianity, like, had nothing to do with church. They were the church, which is the way that I see Christianity, which is, church isn't about brick and mortar. It's about us and us being the church. And they demonstrated in a way that was just unending compassion and love. The last night that I had was a tough conversation about having to rid myself of weaknesses that I was bringing into relationships and endeavors, and finally adhering to the notion of, like, grab onto your strength and move forward and leave your weaknesses buried here in the jungle. And the second that I came to that realization while I was in conversation with the creator, with God, I purged, I puked, but nothing came out of me. It was just me retching for like 2.5 minutes. And the experience of, talk about psychosomatic. Like, after that was done, I felt better than I'd ever felt, lighter than I'd ever felt my entire life. I felt like I had rid myself of a lot of the burden of the trauma, and that I could step into my own skin for the first time and actually start figuring out, okay, like, let's really build upon purpose here. And it was freeing. It was like letting go of the chains.
One thing too, thinking about you being in your mom's apartment and working through that, a big thing for me, and I don't know if this resonates with you, I feel like instead of reliving the fact that they died in this space, I feel like I honor
Yeah.
the fact that they passed in this space.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely understand that. And that I think that's where the notion of sanctuary came from, is that there was the spirit of my mom somehow and the memories we had, because mom was on the uptick and she was doing better and she had come back to herself. I had so many just amazing memories of my mom in there. It was only a couple of years, but we had spent a lot of time together, right? And so because of that, I could lean on those memories of this woman and embrace that and find that calming and soothing, which certainly helped because she was just an amazing woman. And so it became something whereby I could start kind of holding on to the more positive aspects and more positive components of my relationship with my mother, as opposed to focusing on all the loss, all the damage, all the trauma, all the hateful things, right? All the poison. And so it was, yeah, it's so cool that you're still living in that home.
Yeah, it's been quite the journey, and I agree too. I really when people pass, you do have to really think about what life means and what death means
Yeah,
and find peace between both. And I too, I had a pretty profound experience on one of my final ceremonies. I remember, and I hear this all the time of people having ayahuasca retreats and almost having this ego death of sorts. And I wouldn't say I necessarily had it because I think there's always work to be done.
of course. Yes.
It doesn't end. Yeah, it's not like
Yes.
this is a and this is like the misconception in medicine is like you take a pill and you're gonna be healed and that's it.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
It's not how it works.
No, definitely not. So I remember seeing this beautiful flower of life like symbol with like a glow in the background. And I remember this like Om chant kind of coming in and it got louder and louder and I started to feel paralyzed. And it almost felt like I was going through that channel
Mm.
like, going to the light.
Yeah.
And I
Yes.
kind of had this epiphany where I'm like, okay, you go back to source and it's so powerful that you're paralyzed. You have to give it all back.
Right. Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be scary. It's
No.
actually like you have to just surrender to.
That's what I love about that kind of medicine work is we have a tendency, at least I'll speak on behalf of myself. I am a control freak. At least I was. I mean, to the extent that, I told my dad that I would cure his Parkinson's. Like, I remember my first session with my psychotherapist. We started seeking therapy, my dad and I actually together, because Jesse was in rehab, and part of his rehab program was that the family seek therapy for trauma. So dad and I started going to see Roger Thiessen, and Roger asked me a strange question, which was, tell me about your desk. Like, what does your desk at work look like? And I started saying, it's organized. He goes, how organized? Like, well, pens in the right place and computer set a certain way and mouse and keyboard. And he goes, so pens set a certain way, like 90 degrees, like perpendicular. I'm like, yep, proud of it. And he looks at me and he goes, this is going to be hard for you because you have this idea of control. And so you're trying to control your environment. But one of the things you're going to have to learn is that often there is no control. What you can control is yourself. But outside of that, the world is going to happen. And your brother's addiction is so far outside of your control that you're going to have to embrace the notion of surrendering. I had no idea how to do that until I was introduced to the idea of psychedelic therapy, in which case it's either surrender or make this a very challenging experience. You have to give up and give in such that you can slip into the experience and it be fruitful for you. Because if you're trying to hang on, it gets hard, right?
I don't know if that's just the development of the psyche because I too have had to navigate it even in the last like couple years. Kind of feel metaphorically like standing in a river and the river is like pushing you into a direction and you're refusing to like let the motion of the water take you. And I know I feel like we just want to help so bad and sometimes it's just we're all in our own personal journey and that's easier said than done.
Without question, we started Longship about 3 years ago now, which, man, time goes by quick because it feels like we just started this thing, and I got to start it with some brothers of mine, Ryan Collins and John Trapp, two boys that were in that boat with me when I was on acid and MDMA. And, we decided to start creating this thing such that the idea was to help. But we had this conversation. I had a Longship session yesterday. We host something called Council once a month. And so we all get together as men. We sit down We're provided 5 minutes to go through updates based upon our mental, emotional, and physical mountains. And this is all based on a guy by the name of Commander Mark Devine, who's also a partner in this. One of our partners is a retired Navy SEAL commander and 5 times New York Times bestselling author. I mean, this guy is remarkable in his own right, an incredible human being, and that we have him as a partner is a real blessing. But we all love each other. We started this thing together. We were hosting council yesterday and listening to the stories that go around with council and men putting the stuff that they don't really want to talk about on the table, but they know that it's going to be embraced by their brothers sitting in the circle and holding space for that. There's so much struggle. There's so much fighting against that tide and pushing back and pushing back. And the idea of surrendering, I think from a human perspective, but also from a very masculine perspective, is a sign of weakness, right? We don't surrender. We fight and fight and fight. And sometimes it's worth fighting. Sometimes you have to fight. But other times, and many times, sometimes giving in and not giving up, but giving in, surrendering to the idea that we're in a slipstream here and it'll be okay, but it's scary because it's a bunch of unknowns down the river. And so it's can be a challenge.
Yeah. And that's something I wanted to add earlier on. I'm sure there's a level of compartmentalizing your experience that worked for a time
Absolutely.
until it didn't.
I mean, I love my brain. I have come to absolutely cherish my brain because during that time, especially as, dad had passed away and Jess had passed away, and even after mom, all my brain was trying to do was protect me. So it would steer efforts in one way or another so that, there was never a day when I just stayed in bed. Like it was always, okay, get up because you have work to do. There are people that need you. And so, rightly or wrongly, there's this idea of you're going to save your brother today. So get to work, and you're going to save your mom today and get to work. And that did work for a period of time. The issue, I think, becomes when it's prolonged to such an extent and it brings about that notion of ego that you're going to be the savior. There's only so much energy to go around. And eventually, if you're fighting against the tide forever and ever and ever, it leads to burnout and fatigue from a physiological standpoint, we started an organization called Look Health that allows us to do biometric assessment from home so that you can understand your biomarkers and your hormone levels and your lipid levels and you don't have to bring a doctor about to do it. But the reason we started that was because people should know this information. And when I was going through the throes of all this stuff, I would go for a doctor's checkup to see where I was at. And most of the work they wouldn't do because I wasn't symptomatic necessarily of things. But finally, when I did do my blood work, my cortisol levels were shot because I'd been in fight or flight for so long and fighting against the tide for so long that I was just fully depleted. And it leads to adrenal fatigue. It leads to burnout. So,
Hmm.
we have to be resilient in our efforts, but every now and again resiliency also requires us to just take a step back, take a deep breath, and give into it a little bit.
Yeah, and
Surrender.
it's very interesting how we've evolved so much just as a society. I mean, this is not the end all be all, and I don't want to point and say this is everything, but I think a lot about your previous interviews and how I've kind of woven in trying to understand the collective and what's got us to this point. And I do feel like we don't necessarily live in a healthy ecosystem anymore.
No, I think the vast majority of us, if we haven't contemplated it yet, we certainly feel it.
Hmm.
There's a reason why we are having a profound mental health crisis. And obviously, it's not just men. It's women of the like and disconcertingly, where we used to never see or rarely see, children suffering from profound mental health issues. All of a sudden, our kids are trending down this path and we are reliant on social media to provide us value and get the thumbs up and the likes. And I don't know if there's anything more destructive than that to
Yeah,
seek this kind of external validation from an uncaring world is a
absolutely.
dangerous thing,
It
right?
is, I've done quite a bit of research and you seem to be quite knowledgeable when it comes to the brain, our circuitry, and trying to understand it in a way of how, kind of we get pigeonholed into these spaces and stuff and how to heal that. And what I find so interesting from my research, what happens is the synthetic dopamine that we get from social media, it's disconnecting us from our frontal cortex. And so we're losing our empathy. And
Yes.
so yeah, we're offline and we're just all of a sudden we're having these very almost primitive experiences and
Mhm.
we're not able to like heal through it and we're not able to relate to other people and it ends up kind of just being this loop for a lot of us and
Yeah. Yeah, we were having this conversation yesterday about purpose, and how purpose can sometimes be confused. I am gifted with the notion of understanding what my purpose is. I mean, I know that my purpose is to build community. And if I can do that through Longship, perfect. And if I get to do that through Look Health, perfect. And if I get that to do that with Reunion and the ladies at Reunion and bringing about that community to bear, perfect. But that is the position that I find myself in. Community and the notion of community is becoming something that we don't really understand anymore. We don't know our neighbors. We don't communicate with them. We don't rely on them. We've become profoundly self-reliant. There's an ease with which everything comes, and we are also creatures that are dedicated to the notion of struggle. We need challenge in our lives to figure out our value and to feel like we've earned something is profoundly psychologically valuable. But things are so easy, they come so easy, which is making our internal systems exhausted and strange and unhappy. And, there's a lot of people out there that are really struggling. Yeah, we're in a tough place right now.
sometimes I wonder whether we were actually meant to be in such large communities. I don't know to add to exactly what you're doing and the importance of it. I wholeheartedly agree. Have you ever heard of Dunbar's number?
No.
So it's a study done in the 70s, and this gentleman, he has a theory that us as individuals can only have the bandwidth to maintain about 150 relationships, give or take.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
you think about even just Edmonton, you think about any city like bigger, smaller, what have you.
Mhm.
And, I see that there's so many fragmented communities and, we're seeing a growing uh, population of people that are homeless, that are dealing with addiction, that get lost in that.
Yeah.
And I think about, well, they say like the happiest people are like farmers and the happiest people are people that live in smaller communities because
Mhm.
there is more of a close knit circle. There is more of an accountability piece. There is a little bit more of that community sense.
Absolutely. I think it was Socrates that spoke of a hand of five, meaning that you could only really truly have five real friends because the dedication that's required to be a good friend is time consuming when you only have so much time to dedicate. And I hold that dear. I think that's why, one of the worst things that we've done in this 21st century so far is created this social network where we call people friends, but we don't know them. And we've confused that idea of I have 7,000 friends on Facebook. And so therefore, I have a community and I'm popular. And it's like, but if they don't know you,
Hmm.
how could they possibly be considered a friend? And so we're starting to lose our way in terms of understanding what community actually looks like and what's required by it. Because if you're going to be a part of a community, there's a requisite there that you actually are in service, that you give back to that community and function by way of benefiting others. And so there has to be that give and take, that reciprocity that
Absolutely.
we're starting to your point, we're becoming more insular, a little bit more self-involved. It's about what I want. I think about this all the time because our grandparents' generation was like the you generation. We're going to go to war for you. And that's what we're going to do.
Yeah.
And then, the hippies stepped in and it became we, and we're all in this together. And it's the we generation. And our generation, unfortunately, is the me. It's me and it's my feelings and it's what you've done to me. And so it's invited in certain counterbalances and arguments and frailties and victimization. And that, we have to some extent or another a bit of a brittle spirit because if somebody says something that we don't like, the level of offense that we take to it, instead of having a conversation and trying to understand perspective, it's no, but you've offended me. And I am my own God. And it's like, but you're not. You're part of the whole. And we're all in this together. And the sooner we get to that point, the better. But we're not learning that lesson right now. Doesn't mean that we can't change. And I have a lot of hope for the future. Weirdness is on the horizon, obviously, with artificial intelligence and everything. But I also see a dedicated effort to rebuild the notion of community and start building. I think we're starting to figure out just how detrimental it is to our health to not have it.
Think so. Yeah. What I find very interesting too is once again, societally, culturally, and even in like business models, it's like we reward apathy over empathy. Yeah. And then to tie into that Dunbar's number, it's like if you're if your circle and your ecosystem is mainly primarily at work, what does that look like?
Right, right. Families are struggling, and I think of my own kids, and I worry about them. My wife and I had this conversation just last night. I worry about screen time, and I worry about their relationships to their friends, and if they spend too much time in their rooms, what does that mean? And then you watch the mental effect that that has. They go from bright sunshiny to relatively moody pretty quickly, and it's to no fault of their own. It's just how our brains are wired. We need engagement, and we need challenge. We need people to challenge us and challenge our perspective. It's the only way that we're going to grow. I
Exactly.
am right about very few things, but I'm a dedicated learner.
Mhm.
And so I like this. I love having conversations, and I have no problem having a conversation with somebody who wholeheartedly disagrees with me. One of my best friends is a guy by the name of Glenn Ronald, Glenn is one of the most followed artists in the country.
Yeah.
And he was at the event just last week, and he painted that painting for the Humboldt crisis
Yeah.
or tragedy.
Incredibly talented.
He is a very talented man. He and I have very different perspectives. He is like opposite to me in 100 different ways, but I've known him for 12 years. I get to have the deepest conversations possible because there's a recognition of, I don't know, but this is what I think. He's the same. And so we get to wax philosophic on a number of issues where I feel one way and he feels another. And sometimes he's right and sometimes I'm right. And most of the time, neither of us are right, but we're approaching a truth. And that makes for such meaningful dialogue. It's why doing a podcast with somebody like you is so meaningful because it allows us to kind of venture down and it's not, I can't tell you what to do with your life. This is what we see in Longship too, is that, we didn't start Longship such that we could save a bunch of men's lives. We started Longship so that we could build a community whereby they could save their own. Because at the end of the day, it's going to be up to them. And so for us to participate in that endeavor and be able to build the guardrails surrounding that is very, very meaningful. But to express this idea that I know what's best. I don't. I've never walked a mile in your shoes, but I'll walk beside you. I'll do that all day. That's where I find the most meaning in my life is being able to participate in somebody else's life in a meaningful way, not by way of carrying them, but by way of just walking beside them.
I agree. And what brings up to my mind, I think about when I left being a Jehovah's Witness and everything I knew. I would say I'm more spiritual than I've ever been, and my spiritual expression is ever expanding. It's not limited to. So I do encourage the same dialogue to challenge my beliefs because in essence it's like there's a depth to that.
Yeah.
I want to be modeled my blind spots. I also feel like we need more mentorship in this world. We
Yes.
need to learn from each other because what's the point otherwise?
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And man, does that ever speak to me? Before all of this, I believed in God. And it was built upon very rigid structures and notions that sometimes didn't always make sense to me, but I believed in God. Now I have way more questions than I did before, but somehow I know God. I don't believe that there's a God. I know there is. I can't tell you what his path is. I can't tell you I can't possibly contemplate something so massive and complex as God's plan. But I can tell you that there is one. I just can't tell you exactly how he works or try to understand him or her or it or whatever it is, but I know that it's there.
And there's like a beauty to the mystery of not knowing too. That's
Totally.
part of this life experience. That's wonderful.
Absolutely. It invites curiosity and I think curiosity is one of the one of the most important things that we have in our tool belt, and seldom do we exercise it these days. We like to pretend that we know, right? On the conservative side of the equation, we like to pretend that we know best and that the liberals are wrong. The liberals do the exact same thing. We know best and you're wrong. Race, religion. I mean, we've been doing this for a long time. Curiosity will cure this. We need to understand. And so if we can invite a little bit more curiosity into dialogue these days, the better for us.
Absolutely. Yeah. I feel like we should have a follow-up episode.
100%. I would love to.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, to the audience, you can purchase Longship on Amazon. And thank you so much for joining me today.
It was my absolute pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.
Okay.